Welcome to the Science of Hockey, the podcast where we break down the science behind ice hockey. I'm the analyst, your host, and every week we explore the data, research, and evidence that shape how we play, train, and understand the game of hockey. From biomechanics to performance psychology, we take you beyond the rink and into the research lab, giving you insights that go beyond hearsay and into what really makes the difference on the ice. Whether you're a player, a coach, a parent, or just someone passionate about the sport, we're here to bring you scientifically backed information in a language that's friendly and easy to understand. So grab your skates and let's dive into the science of hockey. Welcome to the Science of Hockey, where we bring the latest research to the rink. I'm your host, the analyst. Today, we discuss a study on youth hockey players that explores whether wearing surgical masks impacts their performance. From heart rate to skating speed, find out how players perform safely with masks.
All right, so are masks hurting our kids' hockey game? I mean, that's a question I know a lot of parents and coaches have.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of folks are worried about that.
And well, we've got some new research that might actually shed some light on that very question.
Oh, that's great.
It's a study that was published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health.
Okay.
That's a mouthful. But it came out just last year, so it's pretty recent stuff.
So it's cutting edge.
Yeah. And they took a really close look at surgical masks specifically and how those affect young hockey players.
Interesting.
Especially, during those like really high energy moments in a game.
Yeah, those crucial moments.
Exactly. So they designed this experiment, I guess you could say, to really mimic what it's like out there on the ice during a real game.
Yeah, you got to make sure that it's, an accurate representation of what they're really
Exactly.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, like who and the what of this study. Like, who were the participants?
Well, they had 26 hockey players. Okay.
21 boys, 5 girls.
Okay.
All between the ages of 9 and 14.
So, like, experienced players, like,
Right. We're talking about performance here.
Exactly. Yeah. Not just beginners.
And what kind of tests did they put these kids through?
So they had the players wear either a regular surgical mask or what they called a sham mask.
A sham mask. What is that?
Basically, it was a mask with a big hole cut out so it wouldn't actually affect their breathing.
Oh, clever. So it's like
kind of like a control group, but for the mask itself.
Okay, so they've got their players, they've got their masks.
Right.
What did they actually have them do?
So they had them do a few different tests, both on and off the ice.
Okay.
First, they simulated a hockey period on a stationary bike.
Okay, so like, those bursts of energy, like when they're sprinting for the puck?
Exactly, those intense intervals.
Yeah.
And rest periods, just like in a real game.
But stationary bikes aren't really the same as being out there on the ice.
Right, of course.
Did they actually have them play hockey?
Yes, they did.
Okay, good.
They also had them do an on-ice skating test called the yo-yo intermittent recovery test.
Interesting name. What's that?
So this one gets progressively harder, pushing the players further with each interval.
Okay, so they're really working these kids.
Yeah, they're really
both on and off the ice.
putting them through your paces.
Now, I bet while they were doing all this, they were monitoring their bodies pretty closely.
Oh, absolutely.
Like checking their vitals and all that.
They measured their heart rate, their blood oxygen levels.
Okay.
Even the oxygen levels in their leg muscles using near-infrared spectroscopy.
Whoa, wait, hold on. What's that?
It's basically a way to see how well the muscles are getting the oxygen they need to perform.
So like real-time feedback on how their muscles are doing.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned earlier that some parents were worried that kids would feel like they were working harder with a mask on.
Right.
Like, even if their bodies were fine, they would just feel more tired.
Yeah. But that perception?
Did they measure that too?
They did. They used a rating of perceived exertion scale.
Okay, so how much effort did it feel like they were putting in?
Exactly.
Okay, so they're measuring all this stuff: heart rate, blood oxygen, perceived exertion.
Mm-hmm.
What did they find? Like, did wearing a mask actually make a difference in how these young players performed?
Okay, so here's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I like interesting.
The big takeaway is that wearing a mask during these intense activities didn't really seem to affect the kids' overall performance.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh, that's not what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's a little surprising.
So no noticeable difference at all.
Well, let me give you an example.
Okay.
During those tough Wingate tests.
Landing gate tests.
Those are those short, all-out sprints on the stationary bike. Like, imagine a player going all out for a loose puck.
Oh, yeah. Maximum effort.
Exactly. And they found no difference in power output whether the kids were wearing a mask or not.
So even when they're really pushing themselves, masks don't seem to hold them back.
It seems that way.
What about on the ice, though? Surely those fast-paced drills would show some kind of impact from the mask.
Surprisingly, no. They found no difference in how far or fast they could skate either.
Wow.
And their heart rate and blood oxygen levels stayed pretty consistent too.
So it sounds like those initial worries about masks hindering performance might have been unfounded.
Well, it's actually not quite that simple.
Oh, there's a twist.
Yeah, there's always a twist, right?
I had a feeling it couldn't be that straightforward.
When they looked a little closer at the data, things got a little more nuanced.
Okay, so spill the beans. What did they find?
Well, for example, when the boys were wearing masks during those less intense periods on the stationary bike,
Yeah.
like, when they're skating back up the ice for a face-off,
Gotcha.
their leg muscles actually showed slightly lower oxygen levels compared to when they weren't wearing a mask.
Interesting.
But here's the thing, that difference only appeared during those less intense parts of the test, not when they were sprinting all out.
So a subtle difference, but only during certain types of exertion.
Exactly.
What about the girls? Did they see the same thing?
The girls actually showed a different pattern.
Okay, yeah.
They only had lower muscle oxygen levels during that final hardest sprint on the bike.
So almost the opposite of the boys.
Yeah, pretty much.
And what about how hard they felt like they were working? Remember they measured that too?
Right, that perceived exertion.
Yeah.
Well, the girls reported feeling like they were working harder in the second half of that simulated hockey period when they were wearing masks.
Okay.
But the boys didn't report this difference.
So we're seeing these subtle but kind of interesting differences between how the boys and girls are reacting to wearing masks.
Yeah, for sure.
Even if their overall performance isn't really affected.
Right.
So what do the researchers think is going on here?
Well, that's a great question, and that's what we're going to dive into next.
So we've got these interesting differences between the boys and the girls, how they're reacting to the masks.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Even though it doesn't seem like it's really affecting their overall performance out on the ice.
Right.
What do the researchers think is behind all this?
Well, one theory is that girls might be more efficient at using oxygen,
Okay.
especially at lower intensities.
Interesting.
So that could explain why their muscle oxygen levels only really dipped during that final sprint on the bike.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
hardest one.
Yeah.
Like their bodies were able to compensate until they were really pushed to the absolute limit.
So maybe it's not even about the mask itself, but just like how boys and girls use oxygen differently when they're exercising.
It could be. Yeah, that's a really interesting avenue for more research, for sure.
And those differences in muscle oxygen levels, they sound pretty small to me. Like, how much of a big deal are they really?
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. And, even though they found a measurable difference, it was actually quite small.
Okay.
Probably not enough to actually make a real difference in how the kids played.
So statistically significant maybe, but not like a game changer?
Right, exactly.
What about that feeling of working harder, though? The girls reported that. Could that actually impact their performance, even if their bodies are handling things okay?
Well, the researchers think that perceived exertion, that feeling of working harder, could be linked to that feeling of having to breathe through a mask, even if their oxygen levels are actually fine.
Right, like it's more of a mental thing than a physical thing.
Yeah, it's a subjective feeling that might not necessarily reflect what's actually happening physiologically.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're focused on your breathing because of the mask, you might feel like you're working harder even if your body's doing just fine.
Right, and that could even lead to, pacing themselves differently.
Yeah, or getting discouraged.
Exactly.
So it's like a psychological factor that we have to consider.
Absolutely. It's not just about the physical, it's about the mental, too.
And remember, this study focused on surgical masks specifically.
Right.
What about all those other types of masks out there? Cloth masks, N95 masks, even those masks that are designed for athletes.
That's a great point. And it would be really interesting to see if different types of masks actually have different effects on performance.
Yeah, and how the kids feel.
Exactly, because a thicker mask might make breathing feel more difficult, even if it's not actually impacting their oxygen levels.
Right, so it's like how some hockey gloves are designed for better feel and flexibility, and others are, all about protection.
Exactly.
Different tools for different needs, and maybe masks will be the same way.
Right, and we also have to consider that mental game.
For sure.
How might wearing a mask impact that aspect of sports?
Because there are so many psychological factors at play.
There are. Some athletes might actually feel more secure and confident wearing a mask.
Oh, yeah, like knowing that they're protecting themselves and their teammates.
Right, and that could actually improve their performance.
Like we're all in this together kind of thing.
Exactly, but it could also go the other way, right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Some kids might feel anxious or claustrophobic.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that could really mess with their focus.
Especially, in a team sport like hockey, where communication is so important.
Exactly. If some players are wearing masks and others aren't, you know, could that create some tension or impact how they communicate on the ice?
That's a really good point. There's the physical side of the game, but then there's also that mental and social side.
It's all connected.
And masks could be playing a role in all of those areas.
Right. It's multifaceted.
This is getting really complex, and it seems like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. And, another thing to consider is that this study only looked at what happens when you wear a mask for a single session.
Right.
What about over time, do athletes actually get used to training and competing in masks?
Yeah, like does it become less of a factor both physically and mentally?
Exactly. Maybe those subtle differences in muscle oxygen levels or perceived exertion, they start to disappear as the body and mind adapt.
Right. We need more research to really understand how these responses change over, weeks, months, even years of wearing masks during sports.
Long-term studies are definitely needed.
And the science around masks and their effects, it's always evolving, right?
Oh, absolutely. New research is coming out all the time, adding to what we know and sometimes even challenging those previous assumptions.
So it's good to stay curious and keep learning, especially when we're talking about something as important as the health and well-being of young athletes.
Couldn't agree more.
And, even though this study wasn't specifically about how effective masks are at preventing COVID-19,
Right.
it's hard not to think about that given the times we're living in.
I understand. And while this research doesn't directly address transmission, it does offer some reassurance that wearing a mask, at least a surgical mask, doesn't seem to compromise athletic performance in these young hockey players.
That's a pretty big takeaway for
Right.
sure, especially for, parents and coaches and league organizers
Right.
who are trying to figure out the best way to keep their kids safe.
Exactly. And this research adds, some valuable information to that conversation.
It's not all the answers,
Yeah.
but it's a step in the right direction.
It is, for sure.
So what are some of the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to walk away with from this deep dive?
Well, I think the biggest one is that young athletes are incredibly resilient and adaptable.
Yeah.
Even when you throw a curveball, like wearing a mask at them, their bodies and minds find a way to adjust and perform at a high level.
That's pretty inspiring.
It is. It really shows, the power of the human body.
Yeah.
Another important point is that, everyone is different.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So we can't just assume that masks will affect everyone in the same way.
So it's about recognizing those individual needs and, respecting how each athlete is experiencing wearing a mask, both
Yeah.
physically and mentally.
Exactly. And lastly, I think this research reminds us about, the power of science and asking good questions.
Yeah.
By designing well-controlled experiments and carefully analyzing the data, we can gain these valuable insights that help us make better decisions. And ultimately, help athletes perform at their best while staying safe.
It's all about using science to guide us toward, better practices and create a safer and more supportive environment for those young athletes to thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This whole thing has really got me thinking, about the future of sports. Like, how do we make sure kids can play safely, but also, keep that focus on performance and competition? It's a tough balance.
Yeah, it really is, especially if masks or other protective gear become more common. It raises all sorts of questions.
Yeah, like what about those kids who already have breathing problems?
Right, exactly.
Like asthma.
Like, could wearing a mask, even if it doesn't really impact performance for most kids, could it pose a greater risk for them?
That's a great point. Because
Yeah.
this study, they focused on healthy young athletes.
Right.
So we really need more research to understand how masks might affect kids who already have, those kinds of conditions.
It's not one size fits all.
Exactly.
And we need to make sure that, each athlete has the support they need to perform safely. Right.
Whether they're wearing a mask or not.
And what about those long-term effects? What if kids are wearing masks during practice and games for years?
That's a big question.
Could that, impact how their lungs develop or affect their breathing down the road?
Yeah, we need more research on that, for sure. It's a relatively new situation, so we're still learning.
And we can't forget about the mental side of things either.
Oh, absolutely.
If masks become, just a regular part of sports, how do we help those young athletes adjust?
It comes down to education and communication, I think.
Yeah.
Help them understand why they might be asked to wear a mask, address any concerns they have,
Right.
and, give them strategies to manage any anxiety or discomfort they might feel.
And maybe even find ways to make it fun.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like what if teams had custom masks with their logos?
Oh, and
or players' numbers, it could become part of their identity instead of feeling like a burden.
Yeah, exactly. Turn it into a positive,
Yeah.
empowering experience. This has been a really interesting deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much, the science behind it, the psychological factors, the future of sports.
It's multifaceted.
It really is.
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned a lot, and hopefully your listeners have too.
Me too. And, I hope everyone listening has come away with a better understanding of just how complex this issue really is.
Yeah.
There's still so much to learn, but, this research is a great starting point.
It definitely gives you something to think about.
For sure.
Especially if you're, a parent or a coach trying to make those tough decisions.
Right.
Sounds like masks might not be the performance killer that everyone thought.
Yeah.
But there are definitely some things to consider.
Absolutely. Those individual needs, those psychological factors.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this deep dive.
It does.
It's been great chatting with you.
Likewise, always a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious. Keep asking those questions, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.
Thanks for tuning in to the Science of Hockey. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with your friends, teammates, or anyone who loves hockey as much as you do. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what you liked, what you'd like to hear next, or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us make the show even better. Until next time, keep your skates sharp, your mind open, and keep chasing the science behind the game.